319. This time, I have the pleasure to introduce you to Mauro Cristeche. Mauro is a researcher for CONICET, which is the, well, you can explain what CONICET is if you want, but CONICET is the national sort of science council, social science council in Argentina. He's a professor in law at the Universidad Nacional de La Plata. He's a visiting fellow at McGill, so he's here in Montreal with us. So thank you so much, Mauro, for taking the time to talk to me.
Thank you for having me, Manuel.
So as I told you, Mauro, so this week we are covering issues related to inclusion and exclusion, and more specifically, we're covering themes related to poverty and inequality, right? And about social movements that make claims on these issues, right? And government responses also to these issues. So given your work and activism related to issues on social movements and on social spending more specifically, I wanted to discuss a few themes with you. So first, you know, we always hear Latin America, the most unequal region in the world. Can you speak to whether you think this is actually the case and what inequality actually looks like in Latin America going beyond the broad comparative numbers that we have? So to what extent has there been changes over time also on the overall levels of poverty and inequality in the region?
Well, yeah, Latin America has been considered as the most unequal region in the world. However, in recent years, some experts, especially Thomas Piketty and other scholars from the World Inequality Lab, they have conducted some research that show that the most unequal region would be the Middle East. So according to them, in Middle East, the top decile income shares as high as 64%, and compared to, for example, 60% in Brazil, which is the most unequal region, country in Latin America. So apparently we have now competitors, but in any case, Latin America is a very unequal region, and for sure, one of the most unequal regions in the world. And so what we see in terms of inequality in Latin America is of course, high concentration of wealth. There are elites that have the capacity to capture a huge portion of the cake, you know, so, and then I think there is a fragmented labor market with a large informal sector, which means precarious conditions, low wages, job insecurity or instability. There is a small part of the working class that enjoys good labor conditions and earns good salaries, but then a big part of the working class works under precarious conditions, basically. And the informal sector means half the working class. So the fragmentation of the labor force is something very important in the region. Then the system of social protection is extended in terms of coverage, but the quality of benefits is low. So poverty levels are very high, and we have different expressions of inequalities, education, political inequalities, cultural inequalities, gender inequalities, and then what we see regarding poverty is that children and young people are the ones who suffer the most. And what is very important to explain inequality is that tax systems all around the regions are regressive. Income taxes, they are mainly based on regressive indirect taxes, and income taxes have much less impact than in Europe, for example. And so there are some countries, for example, Mexico, where the tax pressure is ridiculous. You know, it's very low. It's even half of the Argentinian or the Brazilian one, you know? So basically, tax systems in our region work, don't work as an instrument for redistribution. And connected with this, tax evasion is huge in Latin America. It means around 6% of the GDP. And so then, there have been changes over time in the levels of poverty and inequality. Some countries have improved their rates over the last decades, especially poverty rate. Inequality rates have remained in high levels, but for example, Chile, Bolivia, Peru are countries where, the improvement has been quite evident in terms of poverty. Argentina, as you know, is the opposite example. Argentina used to be considered as the model to follow for the rest of the Latin American countries because it used to have solid labor market with a large middle class with similar levels of income to those of European or rich countries. And equality was substantially higher than in every country of the region. But since the 80s, I would say, Argentina has experienced a process of Latino-Americanization. Basically, its socioeconomic rates have been getting closer to those of neighboring countries. So what we have seen regarding to Argentina, right, in the last 30 years is not poor countries of the region getting closer to the Argentinian standards, but Argentina getting closer to them. Beyond differences, we can see that there are some aspects related to poverty and inequality that have improved, I would say, without exception in the whole region. For example, the access to education or the access to the health system. Most of the countries have extended their system of education and health beyond the quality of the service. You know, there are still huge gaps in terms of the access to the system. And then we also see other aspects that even during periods of prosperity remain problematic. Housing is a clear example. You know, housing precariousness, like the growing of villas miserias, favelas, slums, constitute a characteristic of long-standing and pervasive inequality in the region.
Thank you. So moving on to talk a little bit about social movements. You know, how common and how important are these class-based social movements in Latin America? Do you think this is similar across countries, or do we see more class-based mobilization in some countries than others? And what would explain those differences that we see?
Well, I say that working class movements in general, you know, have been very important in Latin America. They have a large and rich tradition in the region, especially in some countries. Then we can see that they assume different ways in terms of origins, in terms of structure and power. You know, for example, Argentina and Brazil are countries where we can find traditional industrial working class, you know, where trade unions have an important influence. The Argentinian trade union movement has been recognized as one of the strongest. And it is the backbone of Peronismo, which is the most important political party in Argentina. In Brazil, the Confederation of Labor Unions and the Partido de los Trabajadores emerged together at the same time in the 80s. And then its leader, Lula da Silva, 25 years or 30 years later, becomes the Brazil's president, coming from the working class unions. So, and in Brazil, there is a particular situation because the Confederation also gathers social movements, not only formal workers or white-collar workers, as it is in Argentina, for example. So in Brazil, you have an institutional confluence between unions and social movements. For example, like MST, you know, Movimiento de Trabajadores Sin Tierra. And the Bolivian case is similar. But in Bolivia, the social movements, especially, you know, indigenous and peasants movements have more influence than the traditional working class, you know. So I would say that these are typical class-based movements that, for example, call for general strikes, you know. But then in some countries, such as Chile, Mexico, Colombia, there, I think the neoliberalism has provoked a significant fragmentation of the working class and its organizations, as everywhere, you know, but in these cases, the damage has been worse and they haven't been able to recover. So the expressions of the working class in this kind of countries are different. In other cases, like Ecuador, or at some point Bolivia, I would say the indigenous movement is very important, you know, and sometimes it is the most radical expression of the social movements, I would say, or even the working class. In Central America, we see much less institutions, working class, traditional or classic institution, but we can see also radical movements, you know? And so despite similarities, there are many differences, and they depend on history, socioeconomic structures, presence of working class parties, the relationship between social movements and governments, and all these expressions are unstable and sometimes unpredictable. You know, one day we have a rebellion in Chile, the day after in Argentina or in Ecuador, then a coup d'etat in Bolivia or in Brazil. But what is clear and what is important to highlight from my point of view is that nowadays in every country or most countries, and for different reasons, because of the consequences of neoliberalism or because it was always like that, I think the working class is very heterogeneous. And the fragmentation is a key element of the situation, because it is also true that part of the working class, especially those in the formal sectors, you know, what we call privileged workers, in quotation marks, sometimes are the support of right-wing options in Latin America. So what we have seen is in recent years is a melange, you know, it's a mix between different sectors or identities. From my point of view, they are mostly members of the working class, you know, but I mean, what have we seen, or what we have seen in the streets in Chile the last years is the working class. Mm-hmm. You know, maybe not many white-collar workers at the forefront, but the feminist movement, students, and so identities and sectorial demands have become much more relevant than in the past. That's also true. That's also a fact.
Yeah, that's interesting, because it's like the difference between sort of the old, more union-based and sort of informality also playing a role, and other identities also organizing those social movements. That's really interesting. So, so on the other side, right, on the side of policy and how states address this. So what do you see in terms of policies to address poverty and inequality in Latin America. So what is the menu of options that has been used by states? And to what extent do you see, states addressing poverty and inequality as a central priority? Have government responses also changed or not?
Yeah, I think the landmark of the Latin American welfare states, especially in the last 2 or 3 decades, have been cash transfer policies. This is pretty clear. And during the post-neoliberal period, there was an important extension of cash transfers programs, mainly in the form of non-contributory pensions and conditional cash transfers, and to the most vulnerable sectors. All these programs are characterized by wide coverage. Before the COVID, around 140 million people in Latin America, which means 25% of the total population were benefited with some income program. And all these policies were extended during the pandemic. But the problem is that the quality of these policies is very low or very poor. And so many people, especially those in the formal sector, fall below the poverty line even when they receive a wage and state benefits. Then, in many countries, education and health system are public. This is something important because most people at least have access to these services. There are also important differences in terms of the quality of the services. And then, this is very important. Governments try to strengthen the labor market, but this is a very difficult issue. Public employment is important, at least in some countries. But one of the biggest challenges, I would say, one of the biggest problems of the region is that it is very difficult to create good quality jobs. So states try to address poverty as a central priority. This is a central issue in the region, but the menu is limited because they don't want to affect big companies, elites. They don't tax them properly, so they must adapt welfare policies to a very fragmented labor market without a sufficient budget. And as a result, what we have or what we see is a system of very precarious welfare policies.
Thank you. So finally, I don't want to sort of take a lot of your time. One or rather two, because every question that I ask has multiple parts, but two more contextual questions here, right? So the first one on the left turn, to what extent do you think that the left turn produced changes in how poverty and inequality are addressed in Latin America? We've discussed sort of multiple ways of talking about the left turn, but like the governments in that period, whether we consider them on the left or not, right? Was there a change? And second, if you can explain a little bit the consequences, and you've gone a little bit into this, that COVID and the pandemic has had on low-income sectors in Latin America.
Yeah, I think during the so-called left turn period, poverty rates have improved. There's no controversy about that. Quite importantly, I would say, but there were not significant changes the left turn was triggered by an economic boom, mostly determined by the rise in the price of commodities, soy, wheat, copper, gas, oil, and its demands by China. And so this economic boom was very important. I would say, without any exception, Latin America, in terms of country, Latin America experienced a spectacular economic growth since the beginning of the 21st century. And I think this fact is a very important element to understand the social improvements during the left turn period, because countries governed by non-left parties, even by conservative parties or coalitions, also experience economic growth and social improvements. And so it's true that these processes lifted millions of people out of poverty, and the labor market conditions recovered, at least partially. Unemployment decreased during the period, and there were also some policies, universal welfare policies that were important, and we should recognize that. For example, in terms of the pension systems, in terms of child protection, and there were also some efforts to make the tax system better, at least in some countries. So I say that left governments were progressive in some respects, definitely not in others: environment, corruption, transparency. But it's true that they achieved some improvements, especially in the immediate material conditions of the low-income sectors, and especially in the first part of the period. But they didn't produce deep changes. I think it was a process of redistributions, moderate, because the cake was bigger, much bigger, but from my point of view, there were not substantial and structural changes, and there were not structural changes in terms of the labor market. There were not structural changes in terms of the tax system, in the access to land or housing, and this is the reason why the improvements didn't last long. And regarding the consequences of the pandemic, well, I think the crisis has clearly exposed this structural social inequality, and so housing precariousness, fragile health systems, huge problems in the labor market. So why Latin America has some of the death rates, the highest rates in the world? Because of Bolsonaro? Well, not only because of him, so it is because of its health systems, because of the informal labor market. Informal workers have little access to social protections and to healthcare, and they have no choice. They have to continue to go to work every day to earn a living. So the result is that their capability to follow quarantine and social distancing measures is limited. So what we have seen is government trying to tackle some structural problems, trying to extend or implement new different cash transfer policies to help millions of people who lost their jobs or suffered the loss of income, and they reach a wide coverage, but these are very insufficient measures to combat the expansion of poverty. And it has been estimated that around 230 million people in Latin America will be living in poverty by the end of 2020. So it means a level last seen 15 years ago, you know? So and on the other hand, what we have seen is that on the one hand, this increasing of the levels of poverty, but then big companies have seen their wealth grow fantastically. So one more time, we can see that crises are an opportunity, you know, for some people, for some sectors. And it seems that the trend toward growing inequality will be even stronger than before, you know, so it can only change if some radical policies are applied.
Thank you, Mauro. So, you know, just to end, this is a question that I've asked of everybody. So if you can share some of your favorite movies or books, some recommendations of, you know, for students to check out, what would you recommend?
Well, I have a lot of recommendations. I always recommend Isabel Allende. Okay. She's a bestseller, a Chilean novelist, part of the so-called magic realism movement with Garcia Marquez and others. I think by reading her books, you can get some knowledge about Chilean facts, Chilean dictatorships. For example, so you can read from her The House of Spirits, La Casa de los Espíritus, or of Love and Shadows, De Amor y de Sombra. These are two fantastic books. Then a less known from Peru is Manuel Escorza. Manuel Escorza is a fantastic Peruvian writer from the 60s. Excellent. I don't know if he has been translated to English or to French. That's okay.
But I use these recommendations for myself too, so thank you.
Okay, cool. For sure, you can find something in Spanish. Another Peruvian, Manuel Vargas Llosas, Mario Vargas Llosas, La Ciudad y los Perros, for example, the city and the dogs. If you want a picture of Latin America, this is not maybe, this is more reality, I would say. Las Venas Abiertas de América Latina by Eduardo Galeano is a very good one. And from Brazil, Jorge Amado, I read Capitanes de Arena. It's a great book. And in terms of movies, well, from Argentina, Relatos Salvajes, Wild Tales, Nine Queens or Nueve Reinas. Bolivia is a less known one, but it's a very good movie.
You know, I went to school with the director of Wild Tales.
The director of Wild Tales is Damian Cifrón.
Yeah, he went to school with me.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So he was very talented even then.
He is. Relatos Salvajes is a very good one.
Yeah.
Then from Chile, Una Mujer Fantástica, Roma from Mexico, Ciudad de Dios or City of God, and Aquarius from Brazil. Conducta is a very good film from Cuba. Okay. And then from Colombia, I really recommend Pájaros de Verano. Okay. And Maria Full of Grace is another one from Colombia.
Thank you so much.
I could tell you 10 more.
We could stay at this. So thank you very much, Mauro. Muchísimas gracias.